So again, welcome everybody to Science Cafe. This is our March installment of this event, and we are extremely excited to have with us today Dr. Christine Folch, who will be presenting on Unearthing Hidden Stories of Yaupon, North America's native caffeinated plant, or why we don't drink it. We totally should. Actually, I want to stop my slide there. And I just want to cover a few things with you all before we get started. One of those being that we will have this talk available for folks who were unable to attend. We're going to be recording it. So if you have friends, family, colleagues, anybody that you think might like to see this later, we'll have it up on our website, and I will share that link in the follow-up email that I send out to everybody after this, and also I will share it at the end of the talk. Additionally, we're going to have a section, it's a question section at the end of the talk. So if you all have any questions, we really encourage you to ask those. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little Q&A feature there. So you'll want to go ahead and hit that Q&A and directing your questions there as opposed to directing those questions in the chat. Yeah, other than that, I would just like to introduce you all to Dr. Folch and let you know a little bit about what she's been up to with her life. So Dr. Folch is an assistant professor of cultural anthropology at Duke University and has a secondary appointment at the Nicholas School of the Environment as assistant professor of environmental science and policy. And she just received tenure. Folch is a scholar of energy politics, natural resources, and environment in Latin America, with an attention to how nature is intertwined with power struggles, national identities, and history. She holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from City University of New York and a Bachelor of Arts in History from Harvard College. She is currently drafting a cultural history of Yerba Mate, the stimulating beverage popular in southern South America, and its lesser known but equally delightful caffeinated Ilex Holly family cousins Guayusa and Yaupon. Her writings on cuisine, culture, and history have appeared in The Atlantic, Slate, and Shalawag. So again, Dr. Folch, without further ado, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. So I know that we are 2 years into Zoom, but still somehow, there are technical questions. So I'm going to try sharing my screen here, and I think it's going to work great. And then we will get into it. So I want to thank Ian for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I am, I'm an academic. I sit in university, I teach students, but it's just so fun to have a chance to talk beyond just, hey, there we go. I don't want you to see my notes. Make sure everything looks good, not that one. See, this is what I'm talking about. All right, let's try sharing this content and doing the right thing again. So it's really fun to get to share with the public. And here we go. Let's do the PowerPoint instead of what I'm going to be reading. And I really wish I could be in person. I've been spending a little bit of time tooling around the website of the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and it's just so lovely. And I love the way you have such a commitment to outreach to your community. It's really great. And so I hope at some point, we'll be able to make the trip down from Durham. Okay, so I am assuming that you can see and hear me, and I trust that Ian, you'll say something, if something has gone terribly awry.
Yep. Everything looks good.
Awesome, great. So, years after a 1528 shipwreck off the coast of Texas resulted in a meandering journey through the mainland and eventually into central Mexico, Spanish explorer Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, wrote in his memoirs of the people and customs he encountered in North America, mentioning Yopon, Ilex vomitoria, in print for the first time. They drink there, and so this is the quote, they drink there another thing that they make from the leaves of trees like that of the holly oak, and toast them in pots on the fire, and after they're toasted, they fill the pots with water and have them there over the fire. And when they have boiled twice, they toss it into another vessel and cool it with half a gourd. And when it has a lot of foam, they drink it as hot as they can handle. And from that moment, they take it from the pot. Until they drink it, they cry out saying, who else wants to drink? And that which they have drunk, they throw up, which they do very easily and without any shame. Hundreds of years later, during the US Civil War, Walter Lenoir wrote his Mother of Life at Camp Lee, South Carolina. We have been out of coffee for some time, but are doing very well without it and have all become so fond of Yopon tea that we will continue to use it, end quote. European expansion into the Western Hemisphere famously began as a pursuit of exotic consumables, many with desirable psychoactive properties. And Lenoir's happy experience with the Yopon Holly was just one of many colonial and settler encounters with the evergreen shrub that grows along the southeastern coast of North America and next to all of you in Georgia. Separated by hundreds of years and hundreds of miles, both Cabeza de Vaca and Lenoir stumbled upon the sole caffeinated beverage native to North America, Yaupon, as it's called where I live in North Carolina, also called Caffeina in Georgia, South Carolina. Yaupon was once so popular in Europe that it was traded and consumed in Paris and London throughout the 18th century, and was common enough that French visitors to Mississippi recognized the drink as something they'd already consumed. John Locke, yes, that John Locke, writing in 1671 on behalf of the Lords Proprietors who oversaw the settlement of Carolina, requested that samples of Cassini be brought back to England with a view towards potential commodities in the colonies. The puzzling question is then, why is Yaupon not the caffeinated drink of choice in the United States? From the first point of contact, Yaupon has iterated between different identities, between ceremony, medicine, caffeinated tea. As inhabitants of the Americas, indigenous, settler, colonial, African, have wielded the leaves' properties to different culturally situated aims. Today's talk is organized around those three identities: ceremony, medicine, caffeinated tea, to help us understand what Yaupon is. Spoiler alert, it's many things. Today's talk is also organized around the idea of commodity chains. That is, tracing a commodity from its source and looking at dynamics around production. So how much does it cost? Who makes it? And consumption. Why do people consume it? Who consumes it? What does the consumption of this product communicate to observers, etc.? An important part of my argument is that the observation that consumption is performative. That is, because we're social creatures. Our consumption has an audience and says something about us. Okay. So think about middle school. Did anyone here pretend to like a certain kind of music because it made us seem cool, even though we didn't like it, or because the person we had a crush on liked it? You don't have to answer this question, but I think it illustrates the point that consumption is performative. We do it not only because we like it, but because it says something about us. So I think that looking at these multiple identities, ceremony, medicine, caffeinated tea, and the complicated dynamics of production and consumption in Yaupon gives us a better handle on the role of caffeinated beverages and plants in our daily lives. So, and this is sort of the growing range, Yaupon, a ceremony. Of the more than 400 species of hollies distributed across the world, 3 found in the Americas are known to possess a combination of psychoactive substances, xanthines like caffeine, that set them apart. And notably, they've been used continually from pre-contact to present. Yerba Mate, which is Ilex paraguayensis, Guayusa, Ilex guayusa in South America, Yopon, the unfortunately named, and we'll totally talk about it, Ilex vomitoria here in North America. And if you want to know more, I'm working on a book called The Book of Yerba Mate, A Simulating Cultural History, and hope to get a contract very soon from Princeton. The name Yaupon comes from the Catawba for small tree. Cassina comes from a sea, creek, or muskegee for leaf. Yaupon is naturally found in the sandy beaches and sandy soils of the North American coast from Virginia Beach to Texas, all the way into Mexico. It grows easily from seed and transplants successfully, as attested to by its current distribution to the hilly inland of the Carolinas, Georgia, Texas, and which 18th century writer James Adair noted in saying that, quote, the Indians transplant it and are extremely fond of it. In addition to caffeine, Yaupon also possesses, and I'll put the map back up so you can get a sense of it, also possesses theobromine, the alkaloid which draws its name from chocolate, which is also found in yerba mate and guayusa, and theophylline, which is found in tea and yerba mate and guayusa. These and other properties of Yaupon made Yaupon desirable, and I am drinking it right now because it's delicious. By measuring the residue presence of all three alkaloids in drinking vessels, archaeologists have recently determined that Yaupon, and possibly Black drink ceremonialism, was present at Cahokia, the pre-Columbian city located in what is now southwest Illinois, hundreds of miles outside of Yaupon's growing range, indicating a lively trade in the leaf. Early British and Irish visitors to North Carolina wrote that indigenous inhabitants of the coasts traded it inland. The Black drink ceremony, so named in English because of the color of the liquid, immediately caught the attention of explorers, missionaries, and military alike, who described the cultural context for the drink. Black drink was taken during council meetings, before important events, notably during the annual green corn harvest celebration, the Bus, which featured heavily in American literature, including, for example, Thoreau's Walden. Women first heated the water in which to boil the leaves. By pouring the drink from one container to another, preparers frothed the liquid. The male leader of the ceremony, a position of high prestige and honor, would then sing a series of notes before partaking of the drink and then passing it around. Frothing or foaming seems to have been an important part of preparing sacred beverages in much of indigenous America. For example, chocolate was frothed in Mesoamerica. And according to most early writers, women prepared the Yaupon as a decoction, boiling the leaves in water for a set of time rather than steeping or percolation. And most, although not all, of the records assert that only certain adult men were allowed to partake of the drink. Of course, these early writers were men, so if there was a female context for it, maybe they wouldn't have known. But it was not the preparation that served as the focus of much English language colonial writing. Instead, the focus was on what happened after imbibing. Ceremony participants easily and regularly regurgitated the black drink, as is shown here in a French depiction. Interestingly, most French writers who got to North America before the English did not even bother to mention anise. And Spanish writers tended to omit it and instead connected Yaupon to a traditional ball game played by North Florida's indigenous inhabitants. Yet so strong is the rhetorical link between Yaupon and regurgitation that the United States Department of Agriculture Fire Service listed Ilex vomitoria as an emetic well into the 20th century. But in spite of its unfortunate name, Yaupon is not in any way an emetic. Scientific study after study has tested its components and found no emetics. Charles Hudson, in his extensive work on Black drink ceremonialism, asserted that vomiting was a learned behavior. And in fact, if you look at the record, you see that 16th century Spanish writers noted that indigenous groups in Florida mixed salt water with cassina to encourage regurgitation in those moments when it was going to be regurgitated. And some Southeast indigenous groups today mix local plants with Yaupon to make the black drink emetic. And I'm drinking it right now just to prove it to you that it is really quite wonderful, and nothing bad is going to happen to me. It's an amazing, amazing drink. So, public ritualized regurgitation disrupted Anglophone notions of gentility and was instrumentalized to depict Native Americans as savage. Yet, politicians and writers around the time of independence recognized and appreciated the importance of the black drink. In a 1775 speech to the beloved men, headmen, and warriors of the Cherokee Nation on the eve of war, one of as he called himself, the beloved man of South Carolina, Congressman William H. Drayton, tried to convince the Federation not to join the British side, but instead ally with the revolutionaries by appealing to the black drink. He talked about, the importance of tea and that it was kind of like black drink. So, what's in the name? Yaupon as medicine in science. Well, because North America's southern coast lay for centuries divided between French, Spanish, and British rule, imperial divisions arose within the scientific treatment of Yaupon and its biomedical study. Though the Spanish and French chroniclers first wrote about Yaupon, William Ayton, head botanist at the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew, recognized Yaupon as a unique species, giving it its official scientific name, Ilex vomitoria, in 1789. The choice of the term is curious, and not only because the leaf had been marketed to a British public for decades under the moniker Carolina tea, but because Yaupon had actually been cultivated in Britain since 1700, as Ayton himself noted, and was actually cultivated at Kew Garden under Ayton's care at that very moment. Though some may see Ayton's word choice as the influence of British imperial writing that prioritized ritualized regurgitation of the black drink ceremony as opposed to other uses of black drink, University of Florida applied ecologist Francis Putz calls the move a kind of economic sabotage. Putz claims that Ayton was, quote, secretly in the employ of Ceylon tea merchants, end quote, who feared competition from Carolina tea and deliberately gave a name designed to invoke disgust. After all, Yaupon was at that time consumed on both sides of the English Channel. Ayton could have, if he were curious, verified the emetic properties of the drink. Despite Ayton's official description, many writers misapplied the name Ilex cassine to denote Yaupon throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, perhaps as an attempt to distinguish Yaupon from its emetic reputation. And well into the 20th century, scientists have debated the correct scientific name for Yaupon. Commercializing Yaupon. So Yaupon was consumed in the North American South long before Walter Lenoir wrote his Mother of the Privations experienced during the Civil War. Multiple attempts at commercializing Yaupon had to contend with some caffeinated competition, as well as something about the intersection of identity and usage. When John Locke specifically asked for Yaupon samples as part of his 1671 inquiry, Chinese tea, had only been on the English market for less than 20 years, and it was an elite luxury item at that moment. Coffee had been introduced to England only a few years earlier, in the 1630s. Europe was only commencing its caffeine habit, and countries had not yet developed a firm preference for a particular product. Why does this matter? Well, sometimes people say, oh, the reason we don't drink Yaupon is because we already had a taste for tea or coffee, and there's just no room for Yaupon in our diet. But that's not the case. I mean, temporally. Yaupon enters a European colonial orbit basically at the same time as coffee and tea. Neither is the problem something about the production side of the equation. So European settlers and Africans, both enslaved and self-emancipated, learned cultivation techniques from the original indigenous inhabitants of the land and planted massive Yaupon nurseries in the 17th and 18th century here in North Carolina. You can see it in deeds. Even if Yaupon manufacture in, for example, the 17th century did not have the same market-oriented production as Chinese tea at the time, Carolina's indigenous and non-indigenous residents nevertheless knew how to grow it and harvest it in really large quantities. In addition to closer proximity to Western European markets and thus lower transportation costs and time, Yaupon also enjoyed a price advantage compared to coffee and tea for the whole North Atlantic market. So I did a comparison of the prices. So for example, 19th century, so when tea was really, really cheap at this point, 19th century Yaupon prices ranged from 50 cents to $1 a bushel, or 5 to 10 cents a pound in the US. Tea at that time cost anywhere from 50 cents to $1.25 a pound in the US. So a difference between 5 cents and 50 cents at the lower end, 10 cents or $1.25 at the high end. Yaupon was cheaper. So the key to this commodification puzzle, why don't we drink it, is not strictly in the production or the circulation aspects of the commodity chain. Instead, I think consumer identity had a critical role to play. During the outcry prior to the US Revolution, Yaupon was marked as like an American beverage, consumed as a matter of protest against the British East India Company and against British attempts to tax tea. But once the conflict died down, so too, it seems, did the urgency to drink Yaupon as a matter of defiance and newly forged patriotism. And trade in Yaupon appears to have subsided. Instead, the southern plant became a solidly southern drink. Quote, almost all the southern coasters who frequent the port of New York are in constant use of Yaupon tea made from this vegetable, end quote, wrote the New York-based Medical Repository in 1806. Through its geographical association with the US South, Yaupon moved from being a cultural stand-in for things and people indigenous to things and people southern. So early writing focused on Yaupon as ceremony through settler ethnographies, often from missionaries of indigenous communities, or on the medical and scientific import of the plant. But the US Civil War remapped race, region, and cuisine in important ways. Francis Porcher's 1863 Medical Botany of the Confederate States cataloged plants that might be useful in the Confederacy, especially attentive to those that substituted for products previously accessed from the North or abroad. And he writes of Yaupon using the South Carolinian and Georgian nomenclature, Cassina. And he writes, the inhabitants of North Carolina purify brackish water by boiling in it leaves, Cassina leaves. In North and South Carolina, much use is made of the leaves of Cassina for making tea, end quote. Rumors of Yaupon usage during the Civil War made their way to the Union. A letter to the editor of Scientific American writes, quote, in consequence of the scarcity of tea at the South, the Southerners are said to be reviving the use of Yaupon, Ilex cassine, of which the North Carolinian Indians made their black drink, and which has been more or less used ever since in that region, though mainly by poorer classes, end quote. Yaupon became, for the North and the South, a hallmark of wartime suffering in the US South, which may help explain why it was treated as a second-rate substitute to be abandoned once opportunity arose. But also Northern cosmopolitan disdain towards white Southerners with attendant stereotypes of intelligence and violence attached to Yaupon drinking after the war. And I have their anecdotes that I'm not mentioning here, Northerners describing Southerners in the ways that one would expect, and attaching Yaupon drinking as kind of a sign of backward Southernness. Yet, even within the South, Yaupon suffered from strong geographical association. As early as the 18th century, Yaupon consumption among white settlers was a marked characteristic of the Carolina seacoasts and continued so for centuries. North Carolina's Outer Banks Islands are steeped in historical lore around their isolation from the mainland, even though they were the first sites of incursion. Here, the Roanoke colony vanished and most likely relocated to the island of Hatteras and intermingled with the indigenous community on the island. And here, the dread pirate Blackbeard had a secret base of operations. Centuries of distance resulted in linguistic and cultural distinctives, notably the Hoyt-Hoyter dialect of American English, including the usage of Yaupon. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Yaupon consumption was both a hallmark of the Outer Banks and part of derogatory hillbilly-like stereotypes of island inhabitants. So the term choppers, from Yaupon choppers, which is how to process it, was an insult used against islanders by North Carolina mainlanders. And phrases like kinnikeeter, Yaupon eater was used to taunt children in Avon, Hatteras Island, and Avon used to be called kinnikeeter. But perhaps most importantly, for Northern and Southern whites, Yaupon was racialized. In 1864, the New York-based Farmers Club featured a small update on Yaupon with the detail. The leaves of these shrubs have been in use by the Aborigines of that district from time immemorial, and the Ilex cassine, or Yaupon, constitutes the tea in universal use there among the Negroes, which has given currency to the common adage, fried hominy, possum fat, and Yaupon tea is too good. The association of possum fat with Yaupon is illuminating. Historian Nicholas Proctor makes a case for racially ordered preferences when it came and comes to cuisine from the perspective of whites in the United States, and thus the perceived inferiority of the consumption of racial minorities and particularly Black communities. Possum as Black game and a Black meal is a repeated trope which appears in both 12 Years a Slave and Frederick Douglass's narrative. Moreover, possum and also raccoon hunting were nocturnal activities and thus would not interfere with daytime duties. If possum and Yaupon were parallels, as the dubiously common Negro adage implies, then the very Black taste for Yaupon meant that a white public would not want to consume it. During Reconstruction and Jim Crow, the strong association continued. A Hatteras Island Democratic leader wrote to a local Democratic congressman in North Carolina in 1898 complaining that, quote, the backbone of the Republican Party here are Yaupon choppers. Whatever the case, in 1905, North Carolinian amateur historian H.H. Grimley visited Hatteras Island to document the last remaining Yaupon factory, which was owned and operated by Old Man Scarborough, an elderly Black man who gathered, chopped, processed, and dried Yaupon along with his family. Even in 1923, and I don't have the picture here, but it's in an article, Nature magazine featured an article on Yaupon processing and use among Black residents of South Carolina's Sea Islands, with photographs of young women stripping leaves from twigs and adult men operating ovens and machinery to dry and chop the leaves. Important details from both pieces suggest a strong cultural continuity between island forms of preparing Yaupon and indigenous techniques. An 1806 article about the creek and the 1905 account of Scarborough here describe the same process. After being chopped with a hatchet, the Yaupon is placed into a barrel and covered with hot stones to sweat the leaves before being laid out to dry. The very structures of slavery and the United States racial caste system meant that Black populations had to manage their own medical well-being, meaning that herbalism was a crucial part of everyday health for Africa-descended communities, despite disparagement by advocates of biomedicine. Indeed, while familiarity with Yaupon and its pharmacological prowess has subsided in the mainstream, knowledge around use of the plant still remains in Black coastal communities in the South. Whatever the reasons for Yaupon's post-Civil War ebb, the long 20th and 21st centuries have seen repeated attempts to popularize the beverage for consumption, with success only frequently. The US Bureau of Chemistry, which is part of the DOA and a direct antecedent to the FDA, prepared a circular in 1922 to advocate for the production of beverages from Yaupon. And they even tested soft drinks made from the plant at the Charleston County Fair. The Bureau's explicit mission was applied research, combining scientific inquiry with economic aims. The writers enthusiastically stated, it was found during these experiments that these products can be produced very cheaply in comparison with commercial tea because of the fact that, one, unlike tea, all the leaves on the plant contain the active principle caffeine. Two, unlike tea, all the leaves can be removed from the pruned branches with live steam. Three, the number of steps in the process of production can be substantially reduced. And four, in the preparation of cassina, a very small amount of hand labor is necessary. They were very excited. Yaupon might have definite advantages to imported tea, but just at that time, Coca-Cola was on its ascent, and the new public company was capitalizing on prohibition, plus a sophisticated advertising scheme that extended to the shape of the bottle and even the modern image of Santa Claus. So whatever cultural space there might be for another caffeinated beverage was filled by an ice-cold soft drink. Although Yaupon was treated as a curio, if that, associated with the Carolina and Georgia Islands for the bulk of the 20th century, new companies have arisen in the early 21st century that attempt what others recommended: putting Yaupon on the US stage. The new companies are built within the growing range of Ilex vomitoria in the United States. So Yopon Brothers is in Florida. Cat Spring and Lost Pines are both from Texas. Yopon Tea Company, formerly a CT, is from Georgia. Notably, none of these companies prominently feature the scientific name, This newly formed American Yopon Association highlights permaculture, an emergent eco-agricultural model that balances profitability and environmental stewardship. The new Yopon production model intentionally addresses both the labor excesses and the land impacts of extensive and intensive caffeine commodity production as part of the business model, which is a distinguishing mark of elite or coffee or tea products, right? There's special ones that are like fair trade, et cetera. But this is now normalized across the bulk of Yopon manufacturer. And in fact, I don't know one that is not actually like organic and, fair wage. All of them that I found are that. Much of the Yopon sold by US-based companies is organic. It's an endemic plant that does not require fertilizers, herbicides, or pesticides. And we used to have some shrubbery Yopon outside our window here. You were at Duke University. I live on campus. And so outside of our dormitory, there was like two massive Yopon bushes that were never, in my experience of living 3 years here, ever watered. And it just grew and grew and grew. So it's organic. And much of the Yopon sold by US-based companies is foraged or grown in small plots of land, like even in backyards in Central Florida. Gone, too, is the anxiety about indigeneity. Instead, mention of a native past is prominent in all the companies. It's a marketing boom. And interestingly, there seems to be a blunting or even a transfer of the idea of indigenous. Native has moved from describing indigenous people to describing the plant. And this new production of Yopon redeems the mistakes of coffee, tea, and chocolate. Consumption also renders its transformative effect on drinkers by committing them ethically in right relationship with the land and with other people. And I'm going to stop there. I'm super curious about the questions and the conversation that's going to ensue. Thank you for this. And I'm going to enjoy drinking this here. Like I said, it's really quite remarkable, and I want to do a scientific experiment in front of you so that you know that this Ilex is not vomitoria. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Folch. That was awesome. That was a wonderful little summation of this plant, and it got me thinking of a lot of other plants here in North America. One in particular, I don't know if you're familiar with the pawpaw, Asimina triloba, but that's another one that in American history has often been disparaged and associated with, or the people who use it have often been seen as lower class, unsophisticated. There are lots of examples of like racial and ethnic slurs that have been attributed to the people that use the plant and eat the fruit. So it made me think a lot of that. And yeah, this is definitely a plant that, yeah, I feel like it's just been so misaligned. And yeah, so I'm glad you were here to kind of, to demystify this a little bit for us. Yeah, so if folks have questions, feel free to shoot. I see that there already is one, actually.
Yeah, so.
Okay, yeah, what a stellar talk, says Lois Singwin. Can you describe the taste?
Yes. So I'm drinking, so what's so fun? Okay, obviously, you know, I need to say this. I have no financial stake in this, which, you know, I'm an academic and I'm a college professor, so it's probably because I'm like not smart enough to actually have bought shares in anything, because I think this is actually going to be really big. I don't have any financial stakes in this. So I'm just telling you my actual opinion. So Yaupon can be roasted to different degrees, and the more you roast it, the more the taste changes. When Yaupon is freshly picked and just air dried or dried quickly in an oven, which I have done both of those things with the plant that used to be here, and then the plant that's in my mom's front yard in Winter Park, Florida, which is next to Orlando. It yields something that has a very strong, like it's really nice. But it will taste kind of like a green tea, and it'll taste grassy. The more that you roast it, the more that the flavor becomes a sweet malted flavor. So the green one will have sort of a taste of honey. By the time you get to something this dark, it has a caramel flavor to it. And so one of the things about Yaupon is that it has fewer tannins than tea does. So it doesn't quite have that, you know, the sort of biting flavor to it. And so it's really, really, really easy to drink. When I introduce Yaupon to my students, and, you know, I tell them the story and I freak them out with the vomitoria, and then they taste it, usually the response is, really, that's just it? I thought it was going to be more, well, like more of an acquired taste or more hardcore, and it's not. So I know that there are, you know, for example, in Texas, the Yopon companies there have actually been able to successfully have their darker brews just exchanged for Southern sweet tea, and the locals don't notice the difference.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's what it's going to taste like. It's going to taste sort of, it's got a honey flavor to a more darker malt flavor. It has a sort of a floral flavor to it, kind of like chamomile. I mean, it's really quite nice. And if you are somebody who has had yerba mate, or somebody who has had guayusa, and so if you're somebody who's been in the southern part of South America, you've been exposed to yerba mate, and if you've been in Syria or Lebanon, you've seen people drinking it there. So you've been exposed to it. Many people in the US have been exposed to it. It kind of tastes like that, but mate is produced, has a processing technique is a little bit different from Yopon. So yerba mate is not just intensely heat dried, which Yopon is. Mate is also frequently roasted on something called a barbacoa, so like a barbecue. So it'll be smoked for 24 to 36 hours under, you know, with a fire underneath it. And so of course it has a smoked flavor to it. This does not have that smoked flavor at all. So just to give a little bit of a sense of the flavor profile.
So for you personally, would you say that, like, between the three species, Yopon, yerba mate, and guayusa, is there one that you prefer?
Oh, I can't say that. I'm a researcher.
Yeah. Yeah. I was
no, I can't do that. I'm writing a book on yerba mate. I will say this. I think you know, I think these Ilex beverages offer something really interesting to drinkers. And one of the things is that they have terroir. So your Yopon is going to taste differently depending on whether the Yopon is harvested on the island of Hatteras, facing the ocean, and, you know, it's basically the kind of plant that grows on the shore and protects the shore from erosion, and it needs no tending to do this, right? So that Yopon is going to taste differently than the Yopon that is raised somewhere where the soil is more loamy. So it will taste like the earth that it is from. This is also true of mate. It'll make a difference if they're shade grown or not. And so I think one of the things that's really fun about this plant is that you can experiment with different levels of roasting, but you can also experiment with different locations of harvesting. And this knowledge is just being rediscovered in the United States. So these companies are all run by people who are like basically younger than I am. So I'm in my mid-40s. These are people who are younger, who kind of discovered the plant and are just testing it out, and they're trying, you know, what happens if we heat it up like this? What happens if what happens if we grind it like that? What happens if it's grown here? And so there's a lot of experimentation that's happening right now with Yaupon. Now with something like yerba mate, what's super fascinating about this, and I can talk about yerba mate forever, which is why I'm writing a book on it. Yerba mate was immediately transferred into massive commercial agriculture in the 16th century. So in the 1530s and 1540s, people in what is now Paraguay were already commercializing mate, which means there's so much experimentation happening right now with mate, but that means people were intentionally experimenting with flavor profiles for different markets from the 1500s. And so that knowledge has been maintained, particularly in Paraguay. And to a lesser extent, it's been now transferred to Argentina and Brazil, where mate also grows and is produced en masse. But so that kind of knowledge is deeper history in South America, whereas here in the US, I think this is going to change next year.
Yeah, great. So we have a couple questions about the caffeine content.
Oh yeah.
Anonymous attendee is asking, what is the caffeine level comparable to? And then also Corey Vaughn asks, how does it compare to yerba mate?
Yeah, so very comparable to yerba mate. So this is one of the other things, like this plant has not been standardized. So one of your plants might have more caffeine than the other one that's shrubbery in your yard, which I think is really amazing. So word on the street, like that I heard from people who harvest it in Ocracoke, is that the female plants have more caffeine than the male plants. But I'm sure there are botanists who are chemists. You all should be doing. Those of you out there, this is what you should be doing. I'm a cultural anthropologist. But so some plants, so it hasn't been selected for necessarily intense caffeine content. And of course that kind of work is probably being done right now by these companies. So it's about the same as yerba mate. Now, where does that position it vis-a-vis like tea and coffee? Well, as we know, tea has actually more caffeine per gram than coffee. So you use less tea to make a cup of tea than you do coffee for a cup of coffee. So mate and Yaupon and Guayusa are all less than either coffee or tea. But that just means you can drink more of it, which is of course what people do in South America with mate, right? Like they drink a lot more. Now, a cup of Yopon is gonna have about the same amount of tea of caffeine as a cup of tea. I mean, it's really like don't drink it at night if you're sensitive to it. The thing that Yopon has, like Guayusa and like mate, and different from coffee and tea, is that it has other alkaloids that are psychoactive that help modulate the buzz. So because it has theophylline and theobromine in meaningful quantities, it means you get the hit from caffeine, so the thing we all love, but it also has these other chemicals. And so what's so fun about this is that how you've probably noticed that there are some caffeinated products that work better on you than others?
Oh yeah.
That's because you have a different body chemistry than other people, right? Like we are ourselves sensitive in different ways, different combinations. And so you can find, this stuff works better for some people rather than tea or coffee because it's got a slightly lower caffeine content, but it has other things that kind of also give you a boost.
All right, so we've got a comment and question from Clifford Blizzard. And you kind of hit on this some, but he says, marvelous talk. How has the trajectory of Yaupon onto the market been similar to and different from that of mate? Yeah. And then also, do you anticipate it will eventually make it into the mainstream, or do you see it remaining a distinctly niche market?
So I came to Yopon because I was working, as I'm telling you, I've been working on a book on yerba mate since I was working on my dissertation research project on something totally different in South America. I work on energy, politics, and nature. But while I was working on my dissertation fieldwork in 2007, 2008 in Paraguay on a very large hydroelectric dam, I really love food, and I love what cuisine tells us about the world. And I think cuisine can seem really innocuous, but then it can get to really intense conversations about memory, the way you feel about your grandmother, displacement, empire, massive economies, etc. Like food can get you to that. And because of that, I was very interested in yerba mate. And so one of the things that is interesting about yerba mate is the Spanish were commercializing it before Europeans were commercializing tea or coffee. So they're commercializing it in the 1540s. Tea and coffee come into Western Europe as curios in the 1600s.
Mhm.
Why don't we drink yerba mate? Was the first question I asked. And so one of the things that I came across in the literature, in the primary documents, was people were trying to sell this stuff to the United States in the 19th century. So it was at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. There was a Brazilian company that got itself incorporated in New Jersey, no, in Philadelphia, but it was reported in New Jersey. Like there was a mate company trying to sell mate to people in the United States, and they had like a beautiful flyer for the Chicago World's Fair that was totally filled with historical falsehoods, to try to convince an American market, a US market, to buy it. And similarly, it's been tried, people were trying to place it in France, and so there's advertisements in French, et cetera, in the 1850s, et cetera, and it just didn't take. And of course, part of what's happened at that point, by the 19th century, is that your coffee interests and your tea interests are very solidified. And of course, wars get fought over these, over coffee and tea. So by the 19th century, they're not going to let some like South American upstart like Yerba Mate into their market. And so then, so they try, and it just didn't get any traction. And finally, I noticed like in the 21st century, mate finally got a foothold. And how did it get a foothold? Not as a tea replacement, not as a coffee replacement, but as something that does what coffee and tea do not, which is to say the kind of mate that made it to the United States was explicitly fair trade. And it was explicitly organic. And social mission and right relationship with land and good treatment of workers was front and center on its branding. And what that meant was that there's a new consumer in the United States that wasn't looking for mass marketed Folgers at the cheapest price, but instead was looking for a caffeine buzz, but wanted it to do more than just deliver caffeine, wanted to use that relationship with a caffeinated product to live out values. And so this eco-consciousness that comes to mate is very important. My favorite North American mate product, I really shouldn't say this. So one of my favorites is a company called Clean Cause. They're in, you can find them in Whole Foods. They're carbonated mate, and they're flavored, and you'll find them in the ice chest. And it was started just a few years ago. It's organic yerba mate, sweetened with organic sugar and organic stevia as well. And the guy who started it was in recovery. He was an alcoholic, and basically was like, I need to find a new drink. And so what he did is he decided to start a mate company with some energy drinks, and half of the profits go to support people in recovery, right? So that's the kind of entrance into the US market that mate has. Interestingly, Yaupon is positioned in very similar ways. Right, so so the question is an excellent one. How does it follow this trajectory? It does not break in the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, even though people try. And the real question for me is, it's really tasty, it's cheaper than tea, it's local, so why isn't it taking? And it's not emetic. The solution, the only thing I can think about is like, well, maybe the people who drank it are the wrong people. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. So now that issue of, oh my goodness, it's indigenous to US is not going to be an X. Oh my gosh, it's like local, you could grow it in your yard, is not going to be, it's not a strike against it. Instead, the fact that all Yaupon is basically organic, the fact that Yaupon companies don't want you to just buy it from them, but they try to teach you how to harvest it from your own yard. Like, it's a different sensibility, particularly in an age of anthropogenic climate change and ecological crisis. A caffeinated product that takes going outside your door to getting into your cup has a smaller carbon footprint, right? And I think, it's harder to roast it as nicely as the professionals do. So, let the professionals also do it. But I think the fact that we can rediscover the flavor of the land that we live on the fact that we can be reconnected ecologically is important. And I do want to mention, and which I have not mentioned in this talk, and it is not an accidental omission. Yaupon is not only a caffeinated tea. Yaupon is a ceremonially sacred beverage, not even beverage, agent. And indigenous people in the United States, who are the original inhabitants of this land, on whose land we are right now, on whose unceded land we are on right now, still have a relationship with this plant. And I don't really write about it very much, not because that's not the case, but because sometimes other people's religious practice is not just for us to write about.
I agree.
Some thoughts.
Yeah. So we have a few folks asking about things related to technique, like anonymous attendee asked, I've read the new leaves of the female plant are optimum for roasting for tea. Is this so, or are there other preferred techniques?
Oh my gosh, so this is also what I've heard, but I'm not a roaster. So
Yeah.
Post pandemic, I think something that would be super fun would be to get in the vehicle and drive out west where people are doing some real, or down south to Florida, where people are doing like some experimentation on all of this stuff. I don't know. And so for this public here, right? Some of you perhaps are in the university. Maybe this is something to play with. Some of you are retired and bored. This is a great project, right? To try to figure these things out. I've heard that the female plants are, are more preferable for that. One of the things that is super interesting is that all the leaves on the plant are going to have basically about the same amount of caffeine. So there might be difference between plants, right? But the plants are not small. Like they can be massive shrubs that take over like a massive amount of land. And so what's fun about it is that, right? So my understanding is that newer leaves are not new, but sort of the younger leaves are more intense. But I have here, so I give away a lot of these leaves, but I bought Yopon tea last time I was in Ocracoke, and I am a huge fan of Ocracoke. It's one of the most remote places in the United States. You can only get there by boat or plane. We don't have a plane.
It's a spectacular place. I agree.
Yes. And so one year, they'll have like a Yopon harvest, and then they'll sell it. And they sell it in like Ziploc bags, the blue and yellow make green. And you can see the leaves that they've chosen. And I think that this is really interesting because this is not, this leaf is pretty, this is one of the pretty large Yopon leaves. Mm-hmm. And what I think is so fascinating about this is that the Outer Banks Islands are where the techniques for Yopon harvesting seem most closely similar to what I have read in the historical record reported among indigenous groups in the 18th century. Now, that doesn't, what that means is I think techniques have remained, and the sensibility of what plant to pick and how to roast it. This, I think is super fascinating. And like I said, when COVID is done and all things are wonderful again, it'd be really interesting to get a little bit more into this kind of the pragmatics of processing.
All right, we've got a question from anonymous attendee who asks or says, I'm familiar with Yopon Holly as a landscape plant, so this is a shocking revelation that it doesn't make you vomit. The blurb on this Zoom made me think it was the berries that were caffeinated, but it sounds like only the leaves are used for drying to make a caffeinated beverage. Is there any use for the berries?
Okay. I have no idea about the use for the berries because that's not what's used for the tea. So I'm sure birds do things with it. So to be very, very clear, don't eat the berries. And I don't know. I haven't read anything about it, but that doesn't mean it's not the case. Now, I want to make a comment about why is this such common shrubbery? Like your point of like, oh my life is a lie. I cannot believe this. Like, it's in my yard. You're telling me it's actually not vomitoria. I thought it was, you know, you can just go to Home Depot and buy it. So this is an argument that I cannot prove, but I think the sort of the clues come together to suggest something really interestingly. So the first thing we know is, like I said, Eastern North Carolina had, up to the end of the US Civil War, something called Yopon nurseries on plantations and farms, which means that as part of, you know, the plantation agricultural economic complex, in addition to the massive amounts of violence that included, part of the way it was spatially arranged in North Carolina was that you would have some sort of field that was a Yopon nursery. And it wasn't like cute little Yopon like plants. It was a place that was effectively possibly a multi-acre Yopon orchard where you just have Yopon there. So that's one thing that's important to note. Now, why is that important? It's because Black people in the South knew about, planted, and cultivated Yopon. Now, why is this important? Well, what is the most, you know, so what do we know about, what do we know about what caffeine does? What caffeine does is it gives you a jolt of energy and it suppresses hunger. If we look at the story of coffee and tea, so I'm moving to a different, you know, product. One of the things that's so interesting about coffee and tea is that, you know, in the 17th century, they're luxury items. They're for elites to use, kind of like, you know, special drugs today, and they're expensive. What happens through the process of industrialization and people moving from the countryside to the city and moving into factories is you also see a massification of caffeinated products. And so, you know, if you work in an office, the coffee is free. Why is the coffee free? I mean, bad coffee, but the coffee is free. Why is that? It's because in the 19th century, people figured out that if you want to get your workers to work more, supplying them with coffee actually is cheap. It gets more work out of people because it keeps them awake longer, it keeps them more attentive, and it suppresses hunger. And so one of the things that's amazing about and tragic about the story of the 19th century is that you get an increase in, so the price of and the quality of tea and coffee go down because it gets mass produced in places like Brazil, or tea plants get, you know, stolen from China and then planted in India and then sent to, you know, England. All of this kind of stuff happens to drop the price of tea, to drop the price of coffee, and to supply it for workers, urban workers in the 19th century. And it is used as a hunger suppressant. And this is important because, you know, these plants are great, but you know why we use them? We use them because they have psychoactive effects on our bodies. And that is sort of this desire to suppress the hunger of workers in factories or mines in order to be able to get them to work longer hours for less pay is a central fact in the history of coffee and tea. And then sugar got added to it. So you get a jolt of energy and a hunger suppressor. And this is the story on these plants in terms of their mass production in the 19th century. They were used to deliver a particular chemical result for people. So I think it is very easy to argue that Yaupon has a similar effect. Yaupon is a hunger killer. And so if you are working long hours, grueling hours, and your food supply is very minimal, I mean, have you seen what enslaved people had to eat for weeks? I mean, like the calories were really low. And the idea was, of course, to keep people underfed so that they don't cause problems. And I mean, like this stuff is really standard. It's in all these farmer almanacs from the 1840s. And so Yaupon suppresses hunger. And so I wonder whether one of the reasons why it is so commonly planted is that it was, we sort of know it as shrubbery, is because it was popularized because of its chemical impacts. This I cannot prove. I can connect dots. I can say who knew how to grow it, I can tell you it's easy to transplant. I can tell you what people did with other caffeinated products. I can even talk about the use of the cola nut in the middle passage. So the water in the middle in the boats that took people from Africa to the Americas was flavored with cola. So it had with cola nut. So it had caffeine in it. So this the knowledge of what caffeine does was deep in the African community and their descendants. I can't document like the Yopon connection, but I can sort of paint all around it. And I think that's why shrubbery is so common.
All right. Well, we're hitting we just hit 7 o'clock, and I think you answered a lot of questions for us, and we really appreciate that. I know there are still a few left. So if folks do have questions that they'd like to ask Dr. Folch, they can go ahead and you'll get a follow-up email. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to forward those along to her for you. Again, Dr. Folch, we really appreciate having you. We appreciate all the folks who came out tonight and all the great questions that they have or had. I am going to share my screen and just share a little bit about, again, I said we're gonna have a recording available of this. You can see the URL for that there. It's kind of long. What I recommend doing is if you want to find our Science Cafe webpage, just Google search Science Cafe Atlanta or Science Cafe at Atlanta Botanical Garden or Science Cafe ABG, anything like that. It's going to be the first thing that pops up in your Google search. And we have past recordings there as well as information about upcoming recordings. And you can go ahead and register for those as well through that website or webpage. Also want to share with y'all, we're going to be switching gears a little bit next month and delving into the world of the subjects of climate change and phenology and pollinator ecology with Dr. Amy Eiler. And she is an assistant level conservation scientist at the Chicago Botanical Garden. That event, as always, will be the third Thursday of the month. So that would be Thursday, April 21st at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And she will be presenting on the drivers and consequences of earlier flowering under climate change. Let's see, one more page to share if I can. Oh, I just skipped it. Okay. Again, if anybody has any questions or suggestions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is isabo@atlantabg.org. Also, check out our website. So atlantabg.org is the main website for the entire garden. And then if you want to check out specifically what we're doing here at the Conservation and Research Department, that would be atlantabg.org/conservation-research/. And we also have an Instagram for those of you that participate in Instagram. And please do follow us at Atlanta BG Conservation. Thanks a lot for coming out, folks. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.